Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. After 3 years of brutal fighting, can the U.S. force an end to the Ukraine war? Let's get to the bottom line. When Donald Trump was running for president, he promised to end the war between Russia and Ukraine in the first 24 hours. But that promise quickly collided with reality. Now, in major shifts in American policy, the U.S. deal grants Russia all the territory that it's gained in the war. It recognizes Moscow's sovereignty over the Crimean Peninsula and blocks Ukraine from joining NATO. Now Ukrainian leaders are being pressed to accept these terms. So is there hope for a freeze? Not a peace accord, but just a freeze in this conflict. And what bleak choices does Kiev face in the coming days? Today, we're talking with Anatol Lieven, director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and he's author of Ukraine and Russia, a Fraternal Rivalry. Anatol, thank you so much for joining us. Look, as this deal is wrestled over with, and as we're recording this deal making is going on, and it's a tough, rock'em sock'em battle between the different players. In part, not just between Russia and Ukraine, between the United States and Ukraine. So I want to ask you, just point blank, because this will be covered in the media. Are we seeing in the deal the dismemberment of Ukraine and the setting up of something like the Munich Agreement in the 1930s that essentially precipitated the Nazi rollover of so many European countries in the past?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the territories occupied by Russia so far are lost, frankly. There's a huge question, of course, over whether this should be legally recognized. But there is no real question about Ukraine recovering them by force because it's tried and failed. The only way it could do that is if the US and NATO go to war for Ukraine, which we've said we won't do. But on the other hand, with our support, the Ukrainians have fought the Russians to something close to a standstill. I mean, Russia has advanced over the past year, but very, very slowly, with very heavy casualties. And I think that's why, as part of this deal, Putin has changed his position. He used to say that for an immediate ceasefire, Ukraine had to withdraw from all the territory of the 4 provinces that Russia claims to have annexed since 2022. He's now given that up and said that the ceasefire line should run where the present battle line runs. So that means that Putin has, at least, as part of this proposed agreement, given up his ambition for more territorial conquest in Ukraine. There's also the point that look at the performance of the Russian army in Ukraine. I mean, does it seem likely or plausible that Russia would risk a direct attack on NATO? And I mean, for what gain?
One of the things that is very interesting about President Trump is he kind of brings people into the room where it happens, to kind of quote the Broadway play Hamilton, by his Truth Social tweets. And I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy segment of a remarkable tweet that President Trump shared. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is boasting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that, quote, Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about here, unquote. This statement is very harmful to the peace negotiations with Russia in that Crimea was lost years ago under the auspices of President Barack Hussein Obama and is not even a point of discussion. Nobody is asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, but if he wants Crimea, why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago when it was handed over to Russia without a shot being fired? But I'm just interested in your sense of Donald Trump bringing us in there, and really he's battling not with Putin in this, he's battling with Zelensky.
Yes, but there's an absolutely critical point there, which is that he said that Zelensky does not, in fact, have to legally recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea, that only America will do it. And that, lets Zelensky off the hook. I mean, really, all Zelensky has to do, which, in fact, he's already done, in effect, is acknowledge that he can't recover these territories by force. Now, on the other hand, of course, the the implication of this legal recognition has pretty drastic implications for Europe, because I think if America does this, Hungary will follow, Slovakia, perhaps Romania after the elections next month, perhaps others in future. And that will create a real rift within the European Union.
Well, let me ask you about the deal you've written in Responsible Statecraft, and I recommend that people read it, by Anatol Lieven, that Ukraine and Europe can't afford to refuse Trump's peace plan. So you're advocating Trump's peace plan. But I'm wondering, and I just want to challenge you, because I've read the piece, whether or not you're advocating a peace plan that would be wobbly, that would leave both sides so deeply frustrated with each other, Crimea under Russian control, Russia not getting other segments of Ukraine that it has its eyes on, and, various dimensions of this. And the real beneficiary is the United States exit, as opposed to an enduring peace. And so I think one of the questions, one of the critics of this process, might say that what is happening right now is you're setting up the terms so that later Russia can come back and take what it wants. The United States has exited, and Ukraine is mincemeat. Tell me where I'm wrong.
The United States is not going to fight for Ukraine, whatever happens. The Biden administration made that clear. Nor, in my view, are the Europeans ever going to actually fight for Ukraine, certainly not without US support. So Ukraine is not going to recover these territories. It will be very unhappy with the result. If we can get Russia to give up its formally abandon its claim on greater Ukrainian territory, then that's frankly it's not ideal, but it's the best that we can get. But of course, there are other issues which so far are not clear at all, which are, will there be any limitations on the arms that the West can give to Ukraine after the war to strengthen Ukrainian defenses? In Munich, the Czechs gave up their whole defensive line to the Germans. Now, that's not what we're asking of the Ukrainians, but will, as part of the peace settlement, it be categorically permitted to go on strengthening Ukraine militarily? Will, as the Russians, by the way, have accepted, Ukraine be free to move towards membership of the European Union? Because after all, from the point of view of the development and westernization of Ukraine, that's just as important as NATO. So, this is going to be an ugly peace settlement. Most are. But there's no point in hoping for something like 1945 and the victory over Germany and Japan, because it's not going to happen. There was nothing very pretty about the peace settlement that ended the Korean War, but it did end the war.
But what are Europe's options here? It's very interesting that the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio pulled out of talks with Europeans that were supposed to be held in London last week, and that was looked at as an opportunity to begin to align with Europe. Look at this. Is the message there, hey, we don't really care what Europe thinks in this operation?
Yes, I think so, pretty much. But then again, the Europeans haven't actually brought forward any positive ideas of their own. All they have said again and again, and when you challenge them, it's all they say is, oh, this is entirely up to Ukraine. Only Ukraine can decide on peace. Well, the point is, you see, that Zelensky, for domestic political reasons, cannot actually propose a compromise peace. It has to be essentially forced on him from outside. So I'm afraid the Europeans have nothing serious to offer there. The key role of the Europeans will be in reconstructing Ukraine after the war and helping Ukraine, if it's possible, to join the European Union. That will take a huge amount of European money, but it's, of course, absolutely critical for Ukraine's future. Now, there is talk, of course, endless talk in Europe of sending a European reassurance force to Ukraine, but the Russians have categorically rejected that because they see it as NATO membership by another name. Trump has said that he will not offer what's called a US backstop for that force, for such a force. And in those circumstances, I mean, if the Europeans had sent in such a force without a Russian agreement, they would be committing themselves to war with Russia. And actually, a whole row of leading European countries have said that they are under no circumstances going to do that, including the Poles, who are, of course, Ukraine's strongest supporters.
I mean, I agree with that formulation in a sense, Anatol, but I also know from talking to many European leaders, many are in Washington right now, that they look at the abandonment of Ukraine, which, let's just be honest, President Trump has threatened to abandon Ukraine. They look at that as a green light to Putin to come in, take the country, and they see their own territory as next. The British and French have talked about deploying a reassurance force if they can get the U.S. to backstop it. Macron, President of France, has talked about layered, coupled in, bundled bilateral security arrangements with Ukraine to try to create a deterrence effect in that. But you're basically saying that sound and fury not meaning much.
No, I mean, continued arms supplies to Ukraine, as I just said, are critical and have to be allowed. I mean, possibly with certain limitations on long-range missiles. But, you know, we have to be able to strengthen Ukraine's defense so that, as they have done in this war, they can make any future Russian attack horribly costly for the Russians and give them, you know, an excellent chance to fight the Russians to a standstill. Because, of course, one thing which, amidst all this European talk of building, you know, huge numbers of tanks and fighter aircraft and so forth has been ignored, is that the key weapons in this war have proved to be mines and drones, defensive weapons. Contemporary weaponry really favors the defensive. And that it puts Ukraine and Europe in a much stronger position. But I have to say, once again, all this talk of a Russian threat to NATO is in NATO's head. It's not what the Russian government is saying. And frankly, I mean, I suppose there's some question over the Baltic states, but why would the Russians want to go to war with NATO? I mean, what does it bring them? One also has to point out, you know, Denmark has been one of the strongest West European advocates of support to Ukraine. To the best of my knowledge, in the whole of Russian history, they've never attacked Denmark or claimed a single inch of Danish territory. It's America that's doing that in Greenland.
Thank you for pointing out the stakes over Greenland. But it raises the issue of Joe Biden, the previous president of the United States, declaring unconditional support to Ukraine and that we would support Ukraine as long as it took, versus this wild swing to now President Trump, who, as you write, is clearly impatient for a deal. He wants it tomorrow. He actually wants it yesterday. And that there are heavy terms and advice that he's putting around Ukraine and saying, take it or leave it. And in that equation, how does this look to the rest of the world? How does it look to every ally? Is America a trustable party in their futures?
Well, I mean, there's so much else that Trump's doing, which raises the question of whether America is a trustable ally. But above all, of course, in the economic sphere, you know, tariffs and so forth, and the threats to Canada, the threats to Greenland. I mean, this is what's undermining US credibility in the world. But when it comes to alliances, I mean, remember that this, after all, is the whole point. Ukraine is not an ally of the United States. It has no treaty with the United States. NATO, of course, does. The US is committed to the defense of NATO, as it is to the defense of Japan and South Korea. This is the key difference. Now, that's why the Russians would have to be so fearful of an attack on NATO, because there is a US treaty obligation. And in my view, that will remain, if only because I see no signs that Trump wants to give up, you know, US bases in Western Europe, you know, Ramstein and Naples and so forth. I think myself that this credibility line is very dangerous, you know, goes back to Vietnam. Oh, you know, yes, okay, Vietnam itself is not very important, but if we let the communists win in Vietnam, then Cambodia will be next, and then Thailand, and so forth and so on. And this turned out to be absolutely nonsense. And so I don't see that, pulling back from a commitment to Ukraine, which never was really a commitment, actually, because, all this talk, stay with Ukraine as long as it takes. No American administration can say that, because there are elections in America, and a new administration can change things. One shouldn't, I think the whole lesson of the Ukraine war is that you should not make these promises, like promises about future NATO membership, that in fact you cannot actually guarantee that you will keep.
Let me ask you another question to invert this. I'm reading right now Ed Luce's interesting book of Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's called Zbig. And in there, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, kind of take credit for drawing then the Soviet Union into Afghanistan to exhaust them, to embarrass them, to help create the dynamics that helped dissolve the Soviet Union. Do you think there's any credibility to the notion that Joe Biden, who didn't promise NATO membership to Ukraine either, helped create conditions that have drawn Russia into an exhausting war in Ukraine? It's not U.S. soldiers on it, but, Russia's in there. This is a distraction. Are we going to look back 10 years from now and say, wow, Joe Biden was brilliant because he created a trap for Russia?
I doubt it, because on Afghanistan, the West was united. On Ukraine, it's not. And look, who knows in 10 years? But if in 10 years' time, we have a row of right-wing populist European governments that in fact want reconciliation with Russia, and if you have deep, deep divisions within the NATO alliance, then certainly we will, which of course did not result from Afghanistan, we will certainly not see this as a victory. But also, look, there is a certain, and speaking here as a realist, but as you know, we're colleagues, I wrote a book called Ethical Realism. There is an ethical issue here. More than 1 million Afghans died as a result of the Afghan war. We ended up overthrowing the communist regime, bringing to power a succession of different Islamist governments, which gave rise to 9/11. We then went back into Afghanistan, recruiting former communist soldiers to fight for us on our side in Afghanistan. Look how well that turned out. The point being that you should be, if you have any conscience at all, should be a little careful about using other countries and other people in this way, and being willing to sacrifice millions of lives for your geopolitical agendas, if in fact those agendas ultimately are not clear because you don't actually understand the local dynamics. But I have to say it's a little odd that Brzezinski should have gone on saying this, because the absolutely critical issue in bringing down the Soviet Union, first in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union itself, was the Polish elections. Zbig, of course, was Polish in the summer of 1989, which led to a victory for the anti-communist opposition. At which point it was clear to Moscow that you either had to launch another full-scale military invasion of Poland to restore communist rule, which of course Gorbachev was not willing to do and perhaps could not even do given the Soviet Union's economic condition by that point, or start an orderly withdrawal. Well, the orderly withdrawal became a very disorderly withdrawal, but it was the transformation of Eastern Europe that began it. Afghanistan, yes, did some damage and undermined the Soviet Union, but it wasn't critical. And you should only be willing, to throw away millions and millions of human lives,
right,
if it's a critical issue. Now, Ukraine for the West has never been a critical issue.
Let me ask you, I've read your article carefully, and you're so precise in quoting and looking at Russian statements, Russian prerogatives, desires. And the question that I would have, that I think many people would have, is a suspicion of Russia. Are they trustable at their word in this moment? What makes you give such weight to their statements?
trust but verify. I mean, look, I'm not saying that I support European rearmament. I support the continuation of NATO. I believe firmly that we have to be totally committed to the defense of NATO members, including the Baltic states and Poland. So, our defenses remain. But as far as trust is concerned, the Russians also, as they go on and on about it, have good reasons to distrust us, given the number of agreements that the US has broken over the past 30 years. But you can't begin by, shouting at each other in this way. That gets nowhere. You have to reach agreements, but including as many guarantees as are actually practically possible to make sure that those agreements stick. But if you start from the standpoint that you simply can't trust the Russians at all, or the Russians start from the standpoint that they can't trust us at all, then there can never be a peace agreement. And then you are simply leaving it to the verdict of victory.
Right.
Now, given the situation on the ground, a victory for the Russians would be horribly costly for them and very difficult. But if either side is going to win a military victory, it's going to be the Russians, not the Ukrainians. And we have to keep that in mind. Somebody who advocates keeping this war going indefinitely is not a friend of Ukraine, in my view.
Just finally, real quickly, Anatol, and thank you for this fascinating discussion. I just wonder if there's something deeper about Donald Trump's seeming public antipathy towards Zelensky. Does he see Zelensky as having been too close to Biden, too close to the Democrats? Is there something underlying there where it looks like Donald Trump is favoring Russia in this and really handicapping and wants to get rid of Zelensky, very clearly wants to get rid of Zelensky?
Well, I think that's right. Of course, we have the whole, backstory of the Hunter Biden case and the Ukrainian role in that. And I think there is an antipathy there. But even leaving that aside, I mean, you also do have Trump's and others within the Republican Party, desire to cut back U.S. international commitments and international dangers. Vance has no personal reasons to dislike Zelensky or Ukraine, but he too is very anxious to, reduce American commitments there. And then, of course, you have the whole camp of Elbridge Colby and people who say that the US needs to do this in order to concentrate its resources, against China.
Right.
So yes, I mean, there is this personal antipathy, but there are, deeper American reasons as well.
Well, Anatol Lieven, director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, I really appreciate your thoughts and being with us today. Thank you.
Great pleasure, Steve, as always. Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? When the Democrats were in the White House, tens of billions of dollars were committed to Ukraine, and there was no end in sight to the support for the Ukrainian side. President Trump sees this conflict as a war that's not even his, and he wants out, fast. The threat of walking away and leaving Ukraine to either collapse or to try to depend on European allies alone is really scary for Kyiv. Washington's gamble could lead to a frozen conflict, which is far from a peace deal, but it stops the bloodshed. The flip side would be that the war goes on and the Trump administration loses interest. The only thing for sure is that America's allies may now have another reason to doubt U.S. commitments to them in the future. And that's the bottom line.